And that's the problem with rewards. They massively undermine intrinsic motivation. And that is why gamification does not work. When gamification does seem to work, it is because the underlying experience was actually already a game. So the real question becomes, what is game design and how can we design products like they are a game?
Hey everyone, today we have a fantastic episode with Rahul Vohra, the CEO and founder of Superhuman. If you've gotten an email in the past couple of years, you've probably gotten one that says sent by Superhuman. They've created the fastest, most efficient email client out there, and I've used it and it's awesome. And I think for me, one of the things that I've admired about Superhuman is just some of the really first principles thinking and non-traditional things they've done in their business. And that's what we talk about today. So we get into their very hands-on onboarding approach. We talk about gaming mechanics and how to build those into your products, and also how to opportunistically look at ecosystems. And so Rahul is an incredibly sharp guy, very thoughtful, writes a lot about some of the things he's done in his business. And today was really our chance to go deep.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who, spent a bit of time thinking about onboarding at Troops, speaking to Rahul at a time when you can't scroll, for more than a minute without seeing someone mentioning product-led growth, product-led sales, and how to do it correctly. I think Superhuman has traditionally been an example of, a product and team that went against the grain and asked for a ton of information up front, and then devoted even more resources to make sure users were activated. And so hearing from Rahul about that journey, how it's evolved and where it's going has been fantastic.
All right, well, let's get into it and hear from Rahul. Hey, Rahul, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you on the show. You're definitely someone whose brain I've wanted to pick for a long time. And maybe just to kind of set the stage, how would you describe Superhuman?
Well, I would say that Superhuman is the fastest email experience in the world. With our product, customers get through their inbox twice as fast as before, reply to their important messages faster, and many of them actually see inbox zero for the first time in years.
And that, is quite a compelling idea, having been in the deluge of a million emails myself. What's the genesis of this idea? When did you decide that this was something that required a solution that you wanted to build?
In 2010, I started a company that many of our listeners may remember, Rapportive. We actually built the first Gmail plugin to scale to millions of users. When people emailed you, we showed you what they look like, where they work, their recent tweets, links to their social profiles. And we grew rapidly. 2 years later, we were acquired by LinkedIn. And during those 4 years, I developed a very intimate view of email. I could see Gmail getting worse every single year, becoming more cluttered, using more memory, consuming more CPU, slowing down your machine, still not working properly offline. And on top of that, people were installing plugins like ours, Rapportive, but also Boomerang, Mixmax, Clearbit, Yesware, you name it, they had it. Now, each plugin took these problems of clutter, memory, CPU performance offline and made all of them dramatically worse. So we decided it is time for change. We imagined an email experience that is blazingly fast, where searches are instantaneous, where every interaction is 100 milliseconds or less. An email experience where you never had to touch the mouse, where you could do everything from the keyboard and fly through your inbox. An email experience that just worked offline, so you could be productive from anywhere. And an email experience that had the best Gmail plugins, but built in natively, and was still somehow subtle, minimal, and visually gorgeous. So with that mission, we set out to build Superhuman. And here we are many years later, and rather excitingly hot off the press, we're now at the point where our customers are saving 3 hours or more every single week.
That's amazing. And I think a lot of what you guys have done is, institutionalize best practices with emails as a part of the product. And that requires, for many people, some behavior change. And I think one of the more radical things that you did with your business is really just focus on individual onboarding, which I imagine out of the gates, a lot of people would say, this doesn't scale. This is way too expensive given how much you guys are charging per user. And just, I guess as a aside, like for a lot of our listeners, who are selling SaaS products, like people that spend less than $5,000 a year don't even get onboarding for many products. And so talk me through the way that you guys thought about onboarding and why you've stuck to that, even amongst, probably common rhetoric that goes against the decisions that you made there.
I always am skeptical of common rhetoric. So much of what we've done has been questioning common rhetoric or wisdom and really thinking things through again from first principles. Now, with respect to onboarding, I've seen a lot of companies, especially in our space, which I would broadly define as productivity and collaboration, get this wrong. I no longer believe in a traditional launch. Let's say you've built a new email client or a new task manager or a new calendar app. The surface area for these products is absolutely massive, bigger than almost any domain you could think of. And what that means is you also get a massive surface area for bugs, as well as massive variability in how users want to use the product. Now, most companies would launch their app, and because the demand for these products is so high, they would fairly quickly get tens of thousands of users. That's not the hard part. But guess what? These users will find thousands of bugs, and the company would quickly get overwhelmed. They would not be able to fix the issues fast enough. And so those users will become disappointed, they'll churn out of the product, and then they'll tell everybody about their experience. And that is the very definition of a net detractor. So in my experience, it's actually significantly better to do what we do. We onboard customers at a measured pace each week. And that way you actually have the bandwidth to find any issues that they are experiencing, and you can focus on making them exceptionally happy.
When you say measured pace, can you expand upon that concept?
The pace that makes sense is the pace at which you can actually fix the issues in time. And this may be really slow. In the early days of Superhuman, obviously, to begin with, we weren't adding customers at all, but as we became ready, it was a trickle. I was adding perhaps 3 to 4 new customers per week. And those were long onboardings. Those were 2 hours long each, and a very specific set of steps that I was walking through. One of the most important of which was watching people use our product. There is such a thing as bug fatigue. If you have a motivated customer, especially one who's paying you, and in the entire history of Superhuman, all of our customers have paid us, the good news is they're going to report bugs. But the bad news is that even the most motivated of users will fatigue from that process. And to make all of this worse, most people will run into the same bugs in roughly the same order. What that means is if you throw a large number of people at a somewhat buggy product, all you'll hear from the same set of people is the same set of bugs. So it's actually really important to start with a trickle, have those folks report the bugs, have the resources in place to fix those bugs, so that for the next week's cohort, assuming that you can fix them inside of a week, you're hearing about different things. This is the only reliable way to create a remarkable quality experience.
I mean, I love the vision and idea that you're talking about here. I can see how impactful that is. And I also, thinking about our business and some of my experience, that definitely can go, that idea of paced growth, it can go against perhaps the demands of investors, of different people on the expectation for you to be growing at a certain rate. And so I'd love to hear how you balance that. And I mean, I guess on top of that, in this period of time, like had you guys raised money? Were you bootstrapping the business when you're taking such a dedicated, slow pace?
We absolutely had raised money, and we've always been aggressive about raising a sufficiently large quantity of money so that we can actually adopt this process being pretty much the only one that results in remarkable quality experiences. In terms of how do you manage expectation, I think there's a relatively simple answer, which is we need to find patient investors. Investors who are signed up for and bought into the idea that we're not just building an email experience, but that we're building the most finely polished and fastest email experience in the world. And that's actually key to what we're doing. That kind of investor is going to understand that there will be this phase where what we're doing is we're getting the product right. Now, there are other metrics that you can put in place to know, of course, how you're doing. You can run the famous Superhuman product market fit engine, which gives you a way not only to measure product market fit, but also a methodology to increase it. You can measure net promoter score. You can measure virality. You can measure churn. You can measure dollar retention. There's all kinds of things that let us know how we're doing. But I think all of these things come after, are your users experiencing a bug-free journey?
That's super interesting, Rahul. And honestly, I went through the onboarding experience myself in 2020, and just hearing you talk about the fact that the early onboarding sessions were up to 2 hours, like that is that's a big ask for a potential prospect, and honestly, right, a lot of resources on your side. But I totally see why you were motivated to do that. I guess my question for you is, as the company has matured, as the product has matured, how has your onboarding process changed and evolved? And how have you actually, gone ahead and tried to automate some of those processes? Because I know that when I did it in 2020, you guys definitely have a really large set of questions that you ask to really get to know the user's motivations for using the product and preferences and things like that. And so I'd love to get a deeper dive on that.
You experienced a very recent iteration of the onboarding where it was already made quite efficient. That's what I would call phase 4 of our onboarding process. So we think about this in 4 or 5 different phases. And for any founder considering onboarding, I would definitely approach it through these phases. So in phase 1, the question is, can the founder onboard, and does it result in great metrics? If the founder of the company can't generate good outcomes, then you know that you still have product market fit work to do. In this phase, I would not worry about the length of the onboarding. And the green light here from moving from phase 1 to phase 2 is, are your metrics great? Now, in phase 2, the question I was asking was, can somebody other than the founder onboard and still generate great metrics? You're systematically removing the notion that maybe it's a little bit of founder magic. And you can also start reducing the length of the onboarding to evolve towards scale. So in our case, we moved from about 2 hours and me doing it to about 1 hour and our head of growth doing it. And the green light here is, are the metrics still great? So we were looking at things like product market fit score, net promoter score, virality, retention, and all of the obvious metrics that you might design. It's also important to include an activation metric in there as well. In our case, we found that even when it was my head of growth doing it, and even when we'd reduced the length of the onboarding from 2 hours to 1 hour, we were still category leading on all of these metrics. Then phase 3 for us was building a full stack growth team. Full stack meaning everyone on this growth team did a little bit of everything in the customer lifecycle. They did a little bit of essentially SDR work, outreach, getting people to book onboardings, then the onboardings themselves, then the customer support work on the other side of that. So the full stack of the journey. We also asked them to figure out how to further reduce the length of the onboardings, and they got them down from about an hour to 45 minutes. And finally, we asked them to build the training plans for phase 4. Phase 4 is when we're going to build a dedicated team. The green light here is, again, are the metrics still great? And in our case, they were. And for context, we hired 3 people to be our full stack growth team to do all of these tasks. Then phase 4, which was the phase that you experienced, was building a dedicated team of onboarding specialists. Now, this is all about repeatable processes and building efficiency, but still maintaining what makes the experience magical, and super effective. And then, of course, there are further phases that we're now in. That long questionnaire that you cited, well, guess what? It no longer exists. We've been able to take that away, which massively increases the throughput at that part of the funnel, and have figured out how to not lose the specificity and the understanding it was giving us of our customers, so we can still onboard just as well. And this is an ongoing journey to continue to make our onboarding experience better, faster, and ever more magical.
I love the intentionality of what you're describing. It's really amazing. And I think, one of the things that I hear is just the willingness of the founder to be the first one that is doing all of the work. And I would say that's, at least for us, that resonates, especially, and also, just early days of founding led sales. My question is like, are there parts of your business today that you're doing that role of being really the first kind of SWAT team in on a particular new initiative or project?
There are. And I think this is ultimately what the founder's role becomes. It becomes hire and maintain and develop an amazing executive team. And where there are holes, be the first person to jump into the trenches, roll your sleeves up and get the work done. I can't talk to too much detail about what those things are because they're very future facing. But long story short, they definitely exist. And I think this becomes the stable state of a founder, at least until you've reached such a scale where that's no longer the case. But at 120 or so folks at Superhuman is still very much the case for me.
One of the questions that I just think about, like, is there a target that you need to have for retention in order to make the unit economics of your onboarding work? Just because, again, I just keep coming back to a lot of SaaS, and I'm not sure what Superhuman costs these days, but I think it's probably less than $1,000 a year a person. I'm just curious, like, how you look at net retention relative to costs of goods related to onboarding.
This is a great question. We can probably get arbitrarily detailed here. So I'll try and keep my answer high level and as useful as possible for folks listening. The answer is yes, but retention is only a part of what makes onboarding unit economic. If you're considering onboarding in the manner that we do it, you need to understand retention and, just as importantly, lifetime value of a single seat or a single account. But you also, just as importantly, need to understand how well you can balance supply and demand. How many onboarding calls, for example, would your onboarding specialists be able to do? Now, at the high end, if you're doing half-an-hour calls, it is feasible for an onboarding specialist to do in the realm of 40 to even 50 if they're going full pedal to metal per week. 40 to 45 is a steady state that many onboarding specialists are able to sustain and deliver high-quality output. This is what we found during the phases of growth that I outlined. So you have to figure out how many onboardings per week an onboarding specialist is going to do. For some companies, they're going to be supply constrained. For some companies, it's going to be onboarding specialist constrained. And that may change over time depending on what's happening at your company. Then, just as importantly, of course, you need to know what is the lifetime value of a seat. If someone reaches an onboarding specialist, what is the lifetime value of that person? For context, Superhuman is far cheaper than thousands per person per year. We charge $30 per month. So over the course of a year, it's $360 per year. And then on top of that, there's an annual discount, which folks often buy as well. Fortunately, we have really, really great single seat retention. One of the things that we pay very close attention to is what are the benchmarks for retention. And on the single seat side, we benchmark very well against best-in-class companies. So best-in-class companies would include Spotify, Netflix, the New York Times. Media companies tend to do best. Then it's fitness companies like Peloton. And then it's subscription consumer goods companies like Birchbox or Hims or Curology and so on. And they're significantly worse at the 12-month point. So we have all of these retention curves that we've worked with our investors to get and to verify. And we benchmark right up there with the Netflixes and the Spotifys of the world. And on top of that, we then also look at our team accounts, which it depends on whether it's a super viral product like Slack, where you're going to be aiming for the 130% plus, or it's more of a SMB-oriented products like HubSpot or Shopify, where you're going to be aiming at 110% plus. But you then want to be looking at your net dollar retention on your team's accounts over the course of the year. And we benchmark extremely well there also. So through a combination of these data points, we're able to build out a overall LTV to CAC ratio, taking into account all of our sales and marketing cost. And we do include onboarding in the cost of customer acquisition. How are we doing? And that's how we know that onboarding works for us.
That makes a ton of sense, Rahul. And I guess, now that we're talking about things like LTV and how, your onboarding really works economically, I can't help but think about okay, so you've onboarded someone, they're activated, they're taking the actions that you find high value, they're getting value, they have a bug-free experience. But what happens from there? I mean, I'm just thinking about your background in gaming and game design. I'm wondering if you've taken any specific actions to kind of to make users feel like while they're in the platform, when they get to month 6, month 12, month 24, are there levels? How are you rewarding users for becoming more sophisticated and making sure they're being pushed down the learning journey with your software?
There are a number of things that we do in order to create an increasingly delightful experience over time. So first, on the human side of the equation, the onboarding specialist who onboarded you is incentivized for that onboarding to be successful. We have a notion of activation or engagement, and there is actually incentive for them helping you achieve that within your first full week using the product. And then over in the realm of product design, you're touching on this idea of game design, and this is a topic that is near and dear to me as an individual. I used to be a game designer in a previous life before I was a founder. And as a kid, I learned to code just so I could make games. But this goes beyond points, levels, trophies, or badges. I would categorize those things as primarily gamification, but not game design. And the punchline here is that gamification does not really work. It is game design that works. And there's a really fascinating experiment that shines the light on the difference here. And this ultimately boils down to human motivation. In the 1970s, Stanford researchers recruited children aged around 3 to 4 years old. And all of these kids were generally interested in drawing. Now, some kids were told they would get a reward, a certificate with a gold seal and a ribbon. Some kids were not told about any reward, so they did not expect one or even know of one. Now, each child was invited into a separate room to draw for about 6 minutes, and then afterwards they would either get the reward or not. And over the next few days, the children were observed to see how much they would continue to draw by themselves. Now, the children with no reward spent 17% of their time drawing. But the children who expected a reward, well, they only spent 8% of their time drawing. The reward had halved their motivation. So what's happening here? Well, researchers differentiate intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. With intrinsic motivation, we do things because they are inherently interesting and satisfying. With extrinsic motivation, though, we do things to earn rewards and achieve external goals. And that's the problem with rewards. They massively undermine intrinsic motivation. And that is why gamification does not work. When gamification does seem to work, because that's the immediate response, we can probably all think of examples where it does seem to work. It is because the underlying experience was actually already a game. So the real question becomes, what is game design and how can we design products like they are a game? And that's something that as a founder, I've gone very deep into. So the long and short of it is we've designed Superhuman as if it were a game.
How does that manifest? I mean, is that things like inbox zero?
It is. And I wish there was a unifying theory of game design, but there isn't one. And so in my journey, as I went deep into this, I learned that I had to draw upon the art and science of things like psychology, mathematics, storytelling, interaction design, to name just a few. At Superhuman, we've boiled this down to 5 key factors. And the reason, by the way, that we did this is I had to figure out how to transmit this knowledge that I'd learned over the years to the folks who work in product and to the folks who work in design. Now, these 5 key factors are things like goals, emotions, toys, controls, and flow. And Inbox Zero is definitely a part of that. Across these, we've identified many principles of game design that ladder up into these 5 key factors. So let's take an example. One principle would be make fun toys and then combine them into games. So to start to wrap our heads around this, we can ask ourselves the question, are toys the same as games? They do seem different. We play with toys, but we play games. A ball is a toy, but football is a game. And as it turns out, the best games are built with toys. Why? Because then they're fun on both levels, the level of the toy and the game itself. So in Superhuman, a favorite toy of our users is the time autocompleter. This is a thing that you use to snooze emails. You hit H, you type whatever you want, it can be complete gibberish, and it does its best to understand you. So for example, 2D becomes 2 days, 3H becomes 3 hours, 1MO becomes 1 month. And the time autocompleter is fun because it indulges playful exploration. What can it do? Where does it break? How does it work? It's not long in an onboarding before people start doing things like, I wonder what happens if I keep on typing the number 10. Well, it turns out that's October the 10th at 10:10 p.m. Or what happens if I keep on typing a sequence of 2s? Well, that's February the 2nd, 2022 at 2 p.m. And then people start trying more complicated inputs like in a fortnight and a day. And it's not long before you find pleasant surprises. Things like time zone math happens without you having to think about it. You can type in 8 a.m. in Tokyo, and without you having to think, that turns out that's 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And then most people are super delighted to find out that if you really want, you can snooze emails until never. You can literally type in the word never, and the email will be snoozed, but never come back. So what I would say is, consider the features of your own product. Do they indulge playful exploration? Are they fun even without a goal? And do they create moments of pleasant surprise? I mean, if so, congratulations, because then you have a toy and you're on your way to building a great game. And that's just one of these 5 key factors. We can go deep into any of them, but I think that illuminates just one of the ways how we've done that inside of Superhuman.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of, our company was originally built on top of Slack and spent a lot of time with the Slack product team. And I think one of their product principles was, to inspire, surprise, and delight, or something along those lines. And they would do these things that seemingly were polished, that maybe wouldn't be traditionally valued as in terms of getting a user to, completion of XYZ action, but in terms of making people truly love the product and platform and stickiness and loyalty, I mean, it paid itself 10 times over. So Rahul, switching gears a little bit. I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about is at the core, productivity, and how do we build products that make people more productive? How do we implement systems in our business that help us understand and optimize the functions that we're trying to achieve? One of the things I'd love to get your perspective on is, how do you think about productivity and mental health? Because at times I have seen them be at odds. At times I've seen them work together graciously. And I would love to hear how, as a leader in your organization, building a productivity product, how you think about that.
We can slice this on a number of dimensions. There's email, there's communication, there's messages in Slack or Teams. And then separately, there is just this whole notion of how this new world of remote or hybrid work is affecting us. And so we actually study this quite intensely. We survey vast quantities of people to figure out where the trends are going. And our current way of work is especially tough on knowledge workers. So last year, we ran a study on remote workers in the US that really shines a light on this. 89% of remote workers said that sorting through email, Slack, and Teams is one of the most unpleasant parts of their day. In fact, 38% of them said that this email fatigue makes them want to quit their jobs. It sounds crazy, but it's true. And for context, these were all folks who weren't yet using Superhuman. They were using, of course, Gmail or Outlook to do this. And it was so bad that 38% of them were considering quitting their jobs over this. If that doesn't set alarm bells ringing in people leadership and leadership more generally, I don't know what will. And more recently, we did another survey just about wellness in the workplace. And this was instigated by the Great Resignation and wanting to understand how people were really thinking. The key takeaway there is employers have to adjust what they do if they want to attract and retain talent. And there were two major trends. Number one, mental health, and number two, flexibility. For mental health, more than half of knowledge workers said that mental health should be a responsibility shared with their employer, and that it massively impacts productivity. For flexibility, 72% of knowledge workers said that a 4-day week would make them twice as likely to stay with their company. And here's the kicker, nearly a third said that they would take a 20% pay cut if they were allowed to work their own schedule. So we can double click on any of these areas, but I think a lot of these are counterintuitive results that many leadership teams are just beginning to wrap their heads around.
So which of these findings resonated most with you and caused you to reevaluate and make a change in your business?
I think the most interesting one from our perspective was that knowledge workers who said that their employer provides substantial mental health resources were actually 65% more likely to rate their productivity as excellent compared to those who did not receive mental health resources. There was another finding as well that really spoke to me, which is we're all still facing the challenges of presenteeism. So more than half of remote workers feel the need to respond to an email from their manager in 30 minutes or less. Nearly 60% of remote workers believe that managers reward responsiveness and availability throughout the day just as much, if not more, than substantive work output. So that caused us to pause and to slow down and to reevaluate. On the mental health side, we now offer subscriptions to Calm, obviously a well-known mental meditation app. We have a partnership with TaskHuman, a really great one-to-one coaching tool. We now provide access to mental health providers through our medical plans. And on the communication side, we reworked our communication norms. We now have a virtual first approach to work. Anyone in the organization can work remotely long-term or permanently. and we're working towards ever clearer communication norms. So these were just some of the changes that we made at Superhuman.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. The one that I think is fascinating as well is people's willingness to take a pay cut to work 4 days a week. And I know that this is something that many companies have moved to and tried. And what I don't think it has been explicitly done is that actually reflecting someone's paycheck. I think a lot of companies have just moved to a 4-day work week. And that has broad implications. If a company was able to perhaps have 4 days of better work, more efficient, more productive, more creative, and then additional capital to hire more employees, that seems like a more efficient system than what we've traditionally done. Do you know any companies that have decided to go that route?
The one that springs to top of mind, because he's particularly loud on Twitter, of course, is Ryan Breslow and the folks at Bolt. I don't have any knowledge in how well it's working for them, but they say it's working well. My point of view on this is we still need more data. So we hear the feedback from knowledge workers loud and clear. What we haven't yet seen, apart from a few sporadic studies, is sort of more of a longitudinal view of how this will all end up. What are the unknown unknowns about a 4-day work week? Because, like many things, it sure seems great when you look at it from the outside or when you think about it superficially. But in terms of actually putting it into practice, in terms of the disadvantages that perhaps are not apparent, at least to me right now, because we're still in the early innings of what this means for technology, we want to take as you say, a very intentional approach to any change that we might make. That's sort of true for everything we've done at Superhuman, and it's definitely true here.
Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to congratulate you and your team on the Microsoft Outlook. I guess Superhuman for Outlook is a better way of putting it than an integration. To me, this is something that's near and dear to our heart as a company that has been built on top of key data sources such as Salesforce and Slack, and then subsequently sprawled from there. When did you reach a decision that it was time to move beyond Gmail and to work on Outlook? And how should other founders be thinking about platform dependency?
Well, I'm not sure other founders should do what we did, because I think there are definitely lessons learned here. I think as an interesting aside, founders will appreciate this little set of anecdotes. For our Series B, at the end of the deck, we had a chart of future revenue over time, and of course it went up and to the right. And it was annotated with various things that we were intending to build. The very last thing was Outlook. And for every VC that I pitched, folks were asking, why is this thing at the very end? That is the market. I don't understand why you would wait until the very end. And I had my answer, I had my response, and it was unsurprisingly oriented around getting the product right. We'll build it when we have to. No one has asked for it, and so on. But the crazy thing is, over the last 2 years, we've gone from nobody asking for Outlook support or Office 365 support through a quiet but consistent murmuring to what is now a deafening roar. It is, if you can even call it this, by any way you measure, our largest feature request. More people asking for Superhuman for Outlook than we have people asking for literally anything else. And that was a very tangible, palpable change that occurred over the last 2 years. So for anyone who knows me will know it's no surprise that I place the biggest premium on what it is that customers want. And I always try and blend that with trying to take a very future-looking forwards approach. And so we turned on a dime. We started to invest a tremendous amount of resource in building Superhuman for Outlook. And it really is probably the biggest moment in the company. We're not only delivering our number one feature request, but we're actually bringing Superhuman to the vast majority of the market. So it turns out that 90% or more of paid productivity seats are on Office 365 by comparison to Google Workplace, and that 345 million professionals have paid seats on Office 365. So we couldn't be more excited to bring it to market. We have folks asking for this from companies of every size, segment, and industry. And it's just really exciting. I mean, going from using Office 365 directly to using Superhuman for Outlook, it's a night and day difference.
You know, when I think about Microsoft 365 and Outlook, I think enterprise and kind of like a different customer altogether. I know that's what we experience here at Troops. And so I'm curious to hear more about that go-to-market strategy and get into, you know, what changes you might be thinking of applying to this new market and this new customer.
What's really interesting is that, and I don't know whether this was the case for you, but Superhuman really did start as a product for individuals. But over the course of the last year or so, we have seen accelerating adoption across entire teams and in plenty of cases, entire companies. And this trend has actually only accelerated as we've moved into widespread remote work. So for folks who are eagle-eyed, they will have noticed certain things land over the course of the last few months: dedicated account management, dedicated customer success management, administrative features, centralized billing, the early low-hanging fruits that you might expect for a company going through this transition. And we are working on functionality that is specifically for enterprises. Not stuff I can share too much about yet, but we've laid the foundation, and I'm really excited about what's to come.
That's awesome. That's a incredibly exciting place to be. And I think I might know the answer, but how did you decide to build on Gmail first? But were there any other kind of like leading principles that others can take that you think might be helpful in deciding which platform to build on initially?
I think one principle is simply that of focus. Before deciding which platform to build on, it's probably worth observing that it's worth focusing on one platform. We all have very limited resources, especially as a seed stage startup. And if your goal is to build a product of remarkable quality that creates delight, you're going to want to go above and beyond in the execution and the polish and how, in our case, deeply we were integrating to the APIs. To make that real for a second, we completely re-architected Superhuman to work against Outlook versus working against Gmail. The APIs are completely different, and so how Superhuman works is completely different. Most companies wouldn't go to that extreme, but we do because speed is the core feature. Saving 3 hours a week is the point. You can probably only afford to do that for one platform. Then the question becomes, well, how do you choose the platform? And for us, as I suspect it should be for most companies, we were strategy first. So we had a very clear sequencing of our strategy. 3 phases. Phase 1 was position Superhuman for founders and CEOs of high-tech companies with 25 to 100 people. So call it, 25 to 500 people. My apologies. So call it SMB to mid-market generally. Now, this may seem like a ludicrously tight and narrow niche. There are, maybe thousands of people like this? But that's the point. You want to start with a ludicrously niche position at the beginning and then expand from there. A great example of this in practice is the Tesla master plan, of course, moving from the Roadster to the Model S through their other models, and now the Model 3, which is significantly more affordable. So, having decided on this really tight niche, we then have phase 2, which is deliver the world's fastest and most beautiful email experience. And then phase 3, the phase that we're in now, which is to start to sell into those companies and to acquire more companies to sell into. When you look at phase one, founders and CEOs of high-tech companies with 25 to 500 people, an overwhelming proportion of those people are actually in the Google Workplace ecosystem, despite 90% of the market being in the Office 365 ecosystem. And so we made a strategic bet to start on Gmail, knowing that it would make the edge of our wedge of our strategy, in other words, our beachhead, hyper effective. We wanted to create a really effective, sharp-pointed arrow. And in retrospect, it worked. Most founders and CEOs that I know, and plenty, of course, those that I don't, but most venture-backed company leadership, and it goes well beyond CEOs and founders at this point, is using Superhuman, as are their boards. And there is this virality effect between these leadership communities and increasingly into the organization as we reach directors, as we reach managers, as we reach individual contributors who have a high volume of email. That might be individual contributor account executives or customer success managers or recruiters. And so we're starting to see this viral spread between organizations, up and down into organizations, and of course, as people change jobs and as we start to cross the chasm into the larger part of the market that is represented by Office 365.
I love the thoroughness of the initial ideal customer persona that you have there. And yeah, I was definitely on the other end of getting a lot of emails from founders and investors that say sent by Superhuman and thinking, what the hell is this thing? I don't know what it is, but I want it. So that's just incredible insight to hear just how intentional your team was. I think we're rounding up on time here. So Rahul, I'm just so grateful for you. There's so many amazing things that we were able to discuss today. I guess my last question would be, outside of the Outlook integration, what should we be on the lookout for with Superhuman?
Well, we have a very exciting set of announcements to come this year, not all of which I can share a lot about, but I would encourage folks to keep an eye out for more calendaring functionality. And then towards the end of this year or early next year, Superhuman for Android, which is, once we've released Outlook, that'll be our next most requested thing.
Awesome. Well, those are some very exciting teasers, if you will. And we are so grateful to have you on the show, Rahul. It sounds like you use Twitter. Is that the best place for people to follow you and all the things that you're talking about and learning? Is there somewhere else?
Absolutely. So folks can follow me on Twitter. I am at Rahul Vohra. That's RAHULVOHRA. And my DMs are open in case folks want to contact me. Folks can also, of course, contact me on email. I'm simply rahul@superhuman.com. And if you're looking for access for Superhuman for Gmail or Superhuman for Outlook, please just hit me up.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, and we'll see everybody on the next show.
Thank you.